excited to I was very excited to receive this invitation. Just as I was excited to receive the invitation for Miss Tech, I very much enjoyed that conference and haven't yet really had a chance to congratulate you and the whole Miss Tech crew for putting on such a lovely and enriching conference for us. Um, I don't get as many opportunities as I would like to not just talk about anthroposophy. I get some opportunities to do that, but to just actually do anthroposophy. And so it's it's with a sense of joy and also seriousness and urgency that I accepted this invitation. And it was an opportunity for me to read a cycle of lectures by Steiner in preparation for this that I'd been meaning to read for some time. I'm speaking about the lectures that he gave to the younger generation, to the youth movement in Stuttgart in 1922, October of 1922, later published as Becoming the Archangel Michael's Companions. And Steiner speaks to them both about the failure of education in their time and the rise of materialism and about what they might be able to do not only to re-engage with the older generation, but to also be Janus faced, as he says, to also consider those just coming into this world, the children even younger than them. These were 18 to 25-year-olds that Steiner was speaking to, apparently about 80 of them. And he met with them individually before giving a series of 13 lectures and basically discovered that there were two different impulses seeking expression and seeking support among this group of 80. There was a desire for educational reform, and there was also a desire for a deepening of spiritual community, and that actually there was not as much overlap between these two yearnings that Steiner felt in this group. Some of them seemed to be, if not hostile, at least skeptical of esotericism and anthroposophy, and had heard about Steiner and his attempt to renew education, and so were curious enough to hear him. And then the other group among the 80 did really want to participate more deeply in anthroposophy and whatnot. And so we had a bit of a challenge in arranging these lectures, but I think that even though they were given 102 years ago, 102 years and 1 month ago, to be precise, they're unbelievably relevant um, to our time. So, you know, the age of Michael began in the last quarter of the 19th century and is expected to last, what, 350 years or so. And so we're almost in the middle of that. Steiner was speaking more at the beginning of this Michaelic age. And so things have progressed in many ways, but in other ways, you could almost say that our spiritual development has been somewhat arrested. Um, Sometimes I read Steiner looking ahead into the second half of the 20th century and seeing things progressing in different ways, both getting better and getting worse. And um, I search out in the history of our world since he passed for indications of, how things that he foresaw may have played out. And sometimes I see resonances, and other times I wonder if our world and the darkening of our world and the rise of Ahriman hasn't in fact accelerated massively beyond even what he would have expected. Um, Andrew, remind me, what, 20 minutes, 30 minutes? What's the ideal here? I want to make sure we
Yeah, you can go either.
okay.
We
Okay.
have enough time. We just have to try to stop soon after 8 or even before 8, around
Okay.
8.
Sounds good. Okay.
And leave a little time for a few questions, if any.
So, um, and discussion, hopefully. Although I'm happy to answer questions, but I don't really know anything. So, um, the last age of Michael, there's, the seven archangels and they cycle through. And the last one, Steiner tells us, was during the time of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. And you can see the influence of Michael in the way in which Aristotle's philosophy was still what I would call anthropocosmic. Um, Andrew read that word from my dissertation, cosmotheanthropic. Um, we could even say that Aristotle's philosophy was still cosmotheanthropic, but in particular, it's the anthropocosmic dimension of Aristotle's philosophy that I think is reflective of Michael. And also with Alexander the Great, he was, of course, a conqueror, but he was also, in his own way, uniting East and West and sort of breaking down uh, national ethnic barriers in a way and bringing parts of the world into communication with one another that hadn't yet had that deep cultural exchange. And so I think this is reflective of what, you know, um, more than two millennia later, reflective of some of the challenges that we are faced with, and hopefully some of the ways that Michael can help us. Obviously, there's been a tremendous evolution of consciousness since the time of Aristotle and Alexander, where the cosmic intelligence and um, the wisdom of the world that used to stream into the human being from outside, gradually over the last two millennia, um, that inflow of spiritual intelligence slowed and eventually stopped. And with the beginning of the consciousness age, consciousness soul age, um, we became increasingly cut off from this. And, as Steiner will say, in different ways across his various lectures, there's a sort of secret evolutionary meaning to the rise of materialism in our time, which, as you all know, is to foster human freedom. Um, we had to be cut off from this in-streaming of spiritual intelligence and wisdom from the cosmos so that we could forge a kind of insight out of our own soul spiritual nature, out of freedom, out of the cultivation of our own imagination, to then meet the spiritual world. And in this now, 21, 2200 years later, as Michael comes back around to be the archangel for our time, um, we have help in this effort, and we need help because while in the early 20th century, Steiner was already lamenting the rise of materialism and the um, negative effects of materialism on human cultural life. 100 years later, things have gotten unbelievably worse, and we are threatened again today with the spirit of nationalism and these forces of division that are trying to prevent human beings from being able to discover their shared humanity. And we're also challenged by these very enticing and increasingly pervasive technologies, artificial intelligence, social media. The algorithm is, in some ways, I think, hunting. There are these algorithms, these autonomous artificial systems that are literally on the hunt for human freedom and attempting to squash it so as to addict us to various forms of um, entertainment, and various forms of cheap pleasure that distract us from the very difficult tasks that we are faced with as human beings. And Steiner in the 20s was already seeing the ways in which this new entertainment technology, they used to call them flickers or cinema, the movies were just coming onto the scene. And Steiner saw, in Germany, Central Europe, how addicted people were becoming to these pictures that capture our attention and do our imagination for us, and how much more um, inundated has our culture become by screens nowadays. We don't go to the movies anymore. We carry the movie around in our pocket, always uh, waiting to notify us of the next thing that we need to pay attention to. And so, we're faced with a situation that I think is even more difficult than 100 years ago, where Ahriman, um, who is this dragon of materialism, has, if not fully incarnated yet, then is, certainly um, all but present with us in near bodily form. Um, and so, what are we to do in this situation? And I want to try to speak to the way that Steiner addressed these young people and offered them the pathway forward. Um, and just to speak about age and aging, I'm 38 years old, um, middle aged, I suppose, but I'm still, I think, well, I'll say this: I'm just old enough to remember being 21 and thinking I knew it all, or 14 and thinking I knew it all. And some of the things that Steiner says in his lectures to the youth movement had to do with the way in which human life is human aging. The aging process is a series of rhythms, often 7-year rhythms, right? And there are certain things that I now realize as a 38-year-old that I was not capable of even beginning to understand as a 21-year-old. And this isn't information I didn't yet know about. It's not the content of knowledge that I'm talking about. It's deeper soul and spiritual capacities to recognize the significance of a human life. And to feel, as I move through middle age now, that shift that occurs from being a younger person and experiencing life as full of possibility to moving into the second half of life and realizing um, that this lifetime, the window of this lifetime, is not going to be opening wider. And that in some sense, I am who I am and have the challenges and the gifts that I have to work with. And the rest of life, the mission is clearer and the stakes are clearer than I could have realized as a 21-year-old or an 18-year-old, right? And so one of the important lessons here is, Steiner was speaking to the way in which our individuality, our individual freedom is threatened by the rise of materialism. But at the same time that he always was emphasizing individuality, ethical individualism, and the importance of cultivating our own will, he was also very concerned for this growing insensitivity and lack of interest that we have in other people. And in the age of the consciousness soul, what comes naturally to us is to be concerned with ourselves. We're interested in our own standpoint, our own opinions, our own points of view. And indeed, what is important is our own individual will, but to be engaged in the cultivation of our own individual will really means to cultivate our heart so that we can become confident enough to feel the world from every standpoint and not just our own. In other words, to be able to sympathize with other individuals. Um, and so in this sense, to have great power of soul, it's not just power to affect others, but to be affected by others. Um, and so Steiner was counseling young people to become courageous enough to allow others in without being afraid, without being fearful that uh, we would be exterminated by letting others in, that we would lose our sense of self, right? And so a strong will means not imposing on others, but on the contrary, being confident enough to allow them in, to take an interest in others without fear of losing ourselves. And so that might seem paradoxical, but on some level, yeah, it's being able to cultivate a sense of confidence in ourselves such that we can get ourselves out of the way to let other selves in, and that we really need to make an extra effort in this age of the consciousness soul to take an interest in other people, um, and to be engaged in a spiritual practice that is anchored by a sense of service rather than a sense of mm, personal, just personal development, that can very easily become Luciferic. And Steiner talks about how actually in cultivating this individual will and imaginative capacity that brings the head and the heart together, so that our thinking and our feeling can meet as we exercise thinking itself as an act of will. Um, he really wants um, to emphasize that this process of cultivation of one's imagination is such that we forge new community bonds with one another, and that we recognize that even in natural science, say, uh, if we allow materialism to desiccate our souls, we lose um, the intersubjective and communal bonds that allow actually knowledge of nature uh, to flower, and that there is in our desire to know the natural world, we go through our relationships with other human beings to gain that knowledge. We don't know nature just as separate minds. We know nature as a community. And so, part of Michaelic consciousness, as I have come to grasp it, is, when Steiner says that this is about knowledge as communion, I think he's speaking to the way in which we have to cultivate this social feeling for one another, not just so that we feel closer and have this heart-centered connection to one another, but so that we can know the world truly. And that the scientific enterprise, in other words, it's a collective endeavor. And so if we don't have a human community that's undergirding that research process, then we can't know nature truly. Um, One of the other effects of materialism, of course, is to shrink our sense of what it means to know just to what the sense-bound intellect can reveal to us. And it's this enclosure, this enclosing of the mind to just the sense-bound intellect that leads to this situation where we all feel like um, we have our own standpoints and personal opinions to defend from one another, because we feel very isolated and we're cut off from the common world of ideas, um, that is the same for every human being. And so if we can cultivate imagination, we can step into that uh, shared world of ideas, that world of, I think I can say, that world of etheric formative forces that shapes us, but that we can come to consciously participate in as well. And it's only through cultivating our own thinking capacities that we can burst out of this sense-bound intellect that encloses us, not only cutting us off from nature, but cutting us off from each other. Another way of understanding the Michaelic age is as a battle for the intelligence of the earth. Steiner will talk about how um, this cosmic intelligence that Michael used to be the guardian of has descended to the earth. Um, and Ahriman is desperately uh, trying to gain control over that intelligence and to reduce it to a merely earthly form of intelligence. And this process of mm, the descent of the intellect of the cosmic intelligence to the earth begins, many centuries ago with the rise of nominalism in the Middle Ages. And I think we we can't underestimate the effects of nominalism on our contemporary culture. Nominalism is this view that the scholastics began to really dig into, and the debate is between the nominalists and the Platonic realists, right? And it's all about the nature of concepts and ideas. And while the nominalists became convinced that concepts are just individual constructs that we derive from our experience of sensory particulars, and we come up with a generalization. And in that sense, every particular human being has their own concept for this and their own concept for that, just based on their own experience. And, we have language and we can come to more or less share and coordinate our sense of what we mean. Um, but the nominalists they're basically reducing ideas and concepts to words. We grow up, we see a bunch of particular examples of dogs. You get the little dogs and the medium-sized dogs and the big dogs, and we have the word dog that covers all of them. And that's pretty much what a concept is. Now, the realists, the Platonic realists about ideas, right, thought that universals and concepts had a kind of life of their own. And Steiner doesn't want us to imagine that these universals are just these static uh, forms. They are living beings in a way. And so when we think about, say, the group soul of lions, right, that archetype of the lion is a living being that informs all the particular lions that exist on the earth and that have ever existed on the earth. And I think Steiner wants us to imagine this going two ways too, that the experiences that each particular lion has also enrich and enliven the archetype of lion, right? And so the sorts of real ideas that the realists were defending against the nominalists, right? These are not just static forms, but they are living archetypal beings, right? And we're at a time now when, with the rise of artificial intelligence and very powerful technologies of computation, we are even more tempted as a society to imagine that the human being is nothing but a computer, that the human brain is nothing but a sophisticated computer. And one of the ways in which artificial intelligence and these different um, so-called machine learning technologies have gotten so proficient and efficient at um, creating the illusion that they are conscious and thinking is by mimicking the form of knowledge and learning that nominalists assume human beings engage in as well, which is basically the nominalist approach to education of human beings would be to say, let's just cram the kids full of information, just get as much data in front of them as possible, and they'll extract the general meaning of it. And so with these machines, with these AI systems, it's all about feeding massive amounts of data into these systems so that they can extract generalizations. And then uh, just by being fed endless amounts of text, come up with a probabilistic sort of algorithm to know like what the next most likely word in a sentence is going to be. And so if you use these AI systems, that's all that it's doing is it's, word by word deciding this word's most likely next, that's the most likely next. It's all just probability, generalization. And the materialist worldview would have us believe that that's all human beings are doing too. Um, that there's no soul behind the words that we're speaking. It's just an algorithm running in our brain. And these technologies are, maybe if you're not an anthroposophist, quite impressive. Um, and so it's never been easier to mistake the human being for a computer. And one of the really striking things that Steiner says in this lecture cycle to the younger generation, but he says it in a number of places, is that it's not actually correct to say that materialism is false. Materialism makes itself true because when we believe it, we really do think with our brains. And so this metaphor, the whole family of metaphors that stem from the idea that the human brain is a computer, has severe consequences. And the more that our culture and the technicians and engineers and corporations that are more or less guiding our culture, manufacturing our culture nowadays, if it even deserves the name culture, the more that they push this metaphor, the more that materialism becomes true. And, as a philosopher, it really does function as a bucket of cold water over my head when Steiner says things like, uh, uh, even the most brilliant theoretical refutation of materialism is entirely beside the point. In other words, arguing against materialism in an intellectual way, say arguing in favor of idealism or, even theosophy or even anthroposophy on a merely theoretical level of argumentation, totally beside the point. It might even be worse than pointless to the extent that that overly intellectualized and abstract form of argumentation just further cements the mood of soul in which materialism flourishes. Where everything's about the proof, like show me the proof, where's the logical argument. Um, and so as a philosopher, I take that to heart. I will admit that I have on occasion indulged these attempts to theoretically refute materialism. Um, and I think instead of that, what we might attempt to do is to speak not about spirituality, not about spirit, but out of the spirit. And there's no general formula for that. That's something each of us discovers uh, for him or herself. Steiner says that, he picks on theosophy a little bit in these lecture cycles, but he could have just as easily talked about anthroposophy. He says it would be better for us to have a living relationship to the ideas that structure the periodic table of elements, to have a living understanding of chemistry than it would to have an abstract understanding of etheric and astral bodies and so on. Right. And so it's much more about the spirit in which we are engaged in the process of knowing and being than it is about how we discuss spirituality or anything else. It's about our concepts being alive. And, Steiner will say that philosophy and philosophical trends don't actually play a role in renewing cultural life. But we can look to philosophy for, we can read philosophy that's prevalent in a given time as a symptom of what's coming into society from deeper spiritual sources. And so in this way, philosophy can function, the philosophy prevalent in a time functions as a kind of thermometer. It's not the heater, it's the thermometer. It's a means of measuring what's already happening. Um, and he gives the example in his own time of the philosopher Herbert Spencer, who was a Darwinist and developed Darwin's theory of natural selection um, in the ethical domain. He applied it to social life. And so his famous phrase, everyone thinks Darwin said this, but actually it was Herbert Spencer who coined the phrase survival of the fittest. And it's a really pithy way of summarizing, Darwin's theory of evolution. And Spencer develops the social implications of Darwinism by basically applying the theory of natural selection to the ethical domain, to social life. And it's specifically to resist this application of Darwin's theory of natural selection to social life that Steiner wrote his book, Philosophy of Freedom. Because what Spencer basically says is that individual human beings have these impulses of nothing that's any more grandiose than just a basic feeling of yum and yuck, disgust or joy and different things. And we give expression to these impulses. And either these impulses are in alignment or out of alignment with the existing conventions of our society, right? Either they fit into the social environment that's already given or not. And so we we make these we give expression to these impulses, these instincts, and either they're preserved and taken up by our surrounding social environment, or we are ostracized because it doesn't fit the environment. And moral ideals evolve just in this way, in a more or less utilitarian way. Whatever works, whatever people seem to find useful will proliferate. Um, just as the same way that animal traits do in the natural world, right? That's Herbert Spencer's idea. And Steiner, of course, is in Philosophy of Freedom, trying to bring an awareness to our capacity as free beings through our thinking activity to recognize our capacity for moral intuitions that are not just instinctual, um, rooted in some kind of instinctual urges, but are the result of conscious, fully awake thinking. And he thinks it's absolutely essential that more individuals gain the strength of awareness uh, to bring these moral intuitions to expression. Because again, this Darwinian and Spencerian view, survival of the fittest, it makes itself true the more that it proliferates in our society. And again, 100 years later, there was a time in the middle of the 20th century after the Holocaust, World War II, and all of that, where um, people began to recognize, oh, this survival of the fittest thing and just cutthroat free market capitalism actually not so great. We need to regulate that a little bit. We need a welfare state. We need labor to have rights and so on. And with the fall of the Soviet Union and whatnot, capitalism has no competitor really, and that whole attitude to resist social Darwinism has, I think, fallen away. And now we're back in a situation where it's just like unleash the market forces again. We're back into this survival of the fittest type of mentality. And so I feel as though 100 years after Steiner gave these lectures, that the situation has only grown worse. Whether it's the rise of materialism, the inundation by these technologies that just day after day, moment after moment, every single day, are convincing us that we are ourselves just computers, um, and that all that human life is uh, what occurs from birth to death, that we are just aging bodies. And we also have the increasing sense of meaninglessness. Steiner speaks about the nothingness that young people were confronting as they entered into their teen years and began to go into university, searching for initiation into the universe. That's what we would want the universities to do for us. They found nothing like that. In fact, what they found was nothingness, this deep cultural nihilism. And wow, has that gotten worse today. But Steiner says, look, he says anthroposophists must become awake in this nothingness. We can't turn away from it. He says, turn towards the nothingness and seek in that nothingness the all. We must pass through it. That nothingness is, in fact, uh, the deepest core of ourselves. And it's where we uh, create and cultivate these higher organs of perceptions out of that nothingness, because it must be an act of our own free and loving will. It's not going to be handed to us. And Michael's here to help. Um, I talk to him like he's a friend of mine, and maybe he is. uh, he's here to help, but we have to let him in. And that means standing in that nothingness and not being afraid. So much more I could say, but I would love to have some dialogue um, with everyone. So yeah,
Okay.
there's stuff I've left out, but it'll come to me with questions, hopefully. So I'll
I'm
stop
sure it
there.
will. First, I want to thank you so much again for being here. And I don't know if you've ever wondered, um, many people have placed Steiner's previous lies with Thomas Aquinas and then Aristotle, as you, I'm sure, have heard. And it has always struck me that at the time of Aristotle was, you were pointing at this, a time when the ancient mysteries were dying away and this development of individual intelligence was happening. Um, to the point that by the fourth century it was really over for everything to do with the ancient mysteries, and then the Romans soldiers and the mobs tore down the ancient mystery schools and drove away the teachers and all. um, it would seem to me that in a way the Steiner back then, as Aristotle could foresee, was quite aware of what was changing. And the role that Alexander had was, in a way, to capture all of that mystery knowledge, that it was okay through Alexander to put it into books. And these great libraries of Alexandria came about in a sense, which was filled with these mystery books that didn't exist before. And in a way, I see Alexander almost inspiring in a way similar to what the Grimm brothers did in capturing the fairy tales before they disappeared or got corrupted. I don't know if you thought about that, but it seems to me that's an interesting picture. If we could take up reincarnation, which you can't with your colleagues and so on, but
Yeah. Well, that's a very helpful addition to make, Andrew, about, Alexander putting all of this ancient wisdom, the mystery teachings, to the extent that they could be put into books,
right.
to preserve this knowledge. It's an expression of the way in which that cosmic intelligence was brought to Earth. And a lot is lost in that, but it's part of the evolutionary process. And so what is preserved is just a distant memory in these books, but maybe just enough to keep the embers alight, to help remind us today, uh, to activate these deeper soul capacities, which perhaps can participate in those mysteries in a new way, given our very different evolutionary context now.
Well, it also becomes a way to refute, you know, that this is nothing but a
Mm-hmm.
biocomputer, and then who wrote the software? know?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I don't know if anybody else would like to ask questions. Please, come off of mute and let me, um, while people are pondering their questions, I'll also just mention something that I often say to Mistech audiences is, and you were hinting at this, Matt, is as fearful and as horrible and everything else, all of this technology and what it's doing to culture and society seems to be, there is a kind of cosmic necessity. And I think one of the things it can do for those who can develop this living thinking that you're pointing at is that the life we will have to live in the future will demand more and more this dead thinking. But computers and AI will free us. It will do that. It's already doing. I don't know if you realize, if people realize it, but all day long, it is doing an enormous amount of thinking for us. How many of you still balance your checkbook? How many of you, when you do, yeah, there's a few, right? But it's amazing how much work when you go to buy something and all that the computer is now doing for us all day long that is of this dead thinking quality. And more where we can become free of it. The
But
question
Yeah.
is, what do we do with it? Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead, Susan.
that's my question is how how do we, even if we ourselves look inside at the emptiness and what comes from that, how does that come out into society? How do we get what's needed to counteract all the materialism that is so extreme and worse than 100 years ago? I would agree. Um, I don't know where that link is other than in small little numbers, but we're so cut off from most of the world, and I don't know where the entree of the connection is, and how we bring that living thinking to really good end, necessary, necessary end,
Mm.
interaction with a larger society.
I can see movement everywhere. It looks like John wants to say something. I think Veronica wanted to as well. Go ahead, John.
As a young college student, or in that era, I went through the exercise of trying to prove that what a computer could really do and its tremendous power. And I went through this and I gave examples and etc. But then I realized by doing this, yes, you can go through this, but there's a barrenness in the end. It's barren. It doesn't have that inner spark and creativity and beauty. It's just barren. And so the experience of the barrenness of materialism, that it's just missing a whole, the stuff that really counts and is interesting, it misses it. Okay, it misses it. So we have to enter into this thing, and then we have to experience the barrenness, and from that you get the creative process. You're with me, music, singing, whatever the thing is, and you can experience that, and you realize no computer can bring you this. So um, so I don't know. For me, I never had a fear of the deepest fear of materialism, because I knew it was barren in the end. So I'm just giving you my own personal experience.
I might have that same experiences, but how do we make that morefold? How do we grow that?
People have to enter into it. You don't realize there's like a type of zero there until you actually been in the zero, and then you see it's not fruitful.
We'll go to
Yeah.
Dick next.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, in other words, these are just tools that we have. And if we were the Amish, we wouldn't have a computer and we wouldn't have an automobile. And that's living like the Essenes. That doesn't work. It's doing the things like using these things, but doing your meditations, doing your eurythmies, and then doing what shows up at your individual door, which is going to vary from individual to individual, and meet those things with love.
Yeah. Matt, any comment on that? Is the computer a different kind of tool? Is it different than a hammer?
I think if we were to treat it as a tool, that would be a tremendous improvement. The danger is precisely, again, the metaphorical slippage whereby we start to imagine that we too are tools, that the brain is a tool, or that rather the human soul is a tool to serve the economy or whatever, you know. But you know, to turn and face this nothingness, I think is also Steiner calling us to, and Anthroposophia, and Christ and Michael calling us not to run from the dragon, but to face it, and that there are pathways into the future where these various forms of automation could liberate human creativity. I can still imagine scenarios wherein, you know, through some major changes to political economy, that these tools could actually, you know, from robotics to other forms of AI, actually free us up to be artistic beings, and to not, you know, have to do all the menial tasks. On the other hand, we want to be careful not to, you know, have all of these robots coming into our homes doing all our cooking for us, as if there's not something intrinsically wonderful about doing our own cooking. I wouldn't mind if the robot wants to do my laundry, but
Well, they do have fast food restaurants now without any human beings. You can order and pick up your food,
right.
all delivered and prepared by
Yeah.
machinery.
So, I mean, it's the question, like, for us to consider as a species, whether or not we want to allow the machines to do, say, all of our agriculture, all of our farming for us. Or is there something about the human being that we are meant to be the cultivators of the soil, that's actually a noble task, as much as it's full of blood, sweat, and tears, it's difficult work, but maybe that's deeply meaningful. And to the extent that we do have these robots coming in to do the difficult jobs, that we're actually draining ourselves of meaningful work at the same time, right? And so if we do have all this automation come in, it needs to occur at the same time that we're thinking deeply about our role as artisans, craftspeople, artists. What are we doing to cultivate these skills if we don't have our hands in the soil? And so how we move forward with automation, I think, really needs to be a conversation enriched by a spiritual orientation and not just the calculation of efficiency from an economic point of view, say.
Is that happening?
No,
Really? That's
No.
what I worry about. How do we bring it to the society at large?
Perhaps, Susan, one of the ways it might come is because as workers become more and more productive, and more of what is produced by machines, so you can just make as much as
Right.
you need. It costs the same once you've deployed the machine, essentially. So we reach a point where maybe 70, maybe 90% of the available workforce won't be needed because we'll be consuming goods that machines are doing it all for us. And
Mm.
if we reach a point like that without threefolding coming into play beforehand, what a disaster.
Right, right.
So,
Yeah.
this, I think we have to go through this disaster on the edge in order to truly get to threefolding. Otherwise, we're just playing at it.
Mhm.
So can I ask Matt a question?
Yeah.
Okay, Matt, earlier you said something that just sort of rocked me a bit, and I can't remember what it was, but I know it had to do with nature and doing either participating in you know, in the natural world in not in isolation, but in a group. Does that ring something like you said? Some
Yes.
concept. Okay. Could you explain it again?
So when we are attempting to relate to the natural world just with our sense-bound intellect, just with our brains, and largely science is imagined to be a product of brain thinking nowadays. Part of what's happening there is that we are isolating ourselves as separate brains and thinking that knowledge is something that can be sustained by a bunch of separate brains running around competing with each other for the next scientific breakthrough or something. I mean, there's a certain community spirit and a sense of shared inquiry that provides the condition for true knowledge of nature to be possible. So to the extent that human beings have a vibrant social life and a real capacity to meet one another as individuals, but also with space within each of us to allow the other in, then we can cultivate a real knowledge of the natural world. But the way that science functions today is you'll have a variety of researchers who are professionals trying to make a name for themselves, trying to get more research funding, trying to make sure that they win the Nobel Prize. And so there's a lot of competition, which, some degree, like in the cultural sphere, whether it's in the sciences or the arts or, anywhere in cultural life, we want to strive for excellence. But I think this competitive struggle for existence and survival of the fittest among individual scientists and individual labs and whatnot, competing against everybody else, it really diminishes the quality of scientific knowledge, right? Instead of it being a cooperative enterprise,
Yeah.
right? Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. You brought back exactly what yeah, that was very good. I appreciate it. I also appreciate your talk tonight, and it was actually so very youthful. I really appreciate the yeah, the perspective and the way you spoke, it was just excellent.
Oh,
Thank
thanks,
you for
Barbara.
coming. Yeah.
So one thing I'll say, and I know we're over time, and maybe this is what I'll leave you with, is that, you know, it's so important to recognize education as a lifelong process. And it's not, education is not something that the old give to the young. It's something that's discovered between the young and the old. We educate each other, right? And it's just as important to welcome the young to this earth in a way that allows them to develop what they bring to this earth from their prior lives, as it is for the older people to stay young as souls and spirits, even if they get older in their bodies.
Good, good.
We do need to close. I hate to say, this has been absolutely wonderful. This is our first time trying this, Matt. And so I'm very grateful. It's worked out so well. John, I think you wanted to ask another question or make a point, but can it wait? Okay, thanks.
All right, can I ask one more? Andrew, could you have you on our announcement, was there an email for Matt? Or could you share that with us if it's not?
If you write to me, I'll give you, if it's all right with Matt, give you his email address.
Okay.
I won't put it in the chat right now, but I can
Okay.
send it to you
Sure.
and you can.
Okay.
But I will tell you, Matt's email will respond with, I'm sorry, I can't respond right now because I'm teaching classes and I've got to, you know, prioritize things, but I'll do my best to get back to you or something of this nature, right? So
That's just for my own protection, but I
yeah.
do read my emails, I promise.
He's very good.
A good philosopher's response. Thank you, Matt.
So I'll
Yeah.
close with the verse for America.
Mm.
May our feeling penetrate into the center of our heart and seek in love to unite itself with the human beings seeking the same goal, with the spirit beings who, bearing grace, strengthening us from realms of light and illuminating our love, are gazing down upon our earnest, heartfelt strivings.
Thank you very much.
I thought that fit with what Matt brought perfectly. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining. And Matt, and I'm sorry to rush this through, but we'll hopefully carry on next month too. So bye
Thank
for now,
you.
everyone.
Thank you, man.
Very
Bye-bye.
much.
Everyone.